Yes, hi everyone. So we are now going to start lecture 13 in this particular course, which is Indian economy, some contemporary perspective. Now we have already discussed during different plans that how our industrial sector has performed and what were the reasons for revival of that particular sector after independence, what all difficulties we had to face, and how we have prioritized our industrial growth as one of the backbones of India's economy. But there are certain developments that I did not cover at that time because it was mostly focused on India's planning process. So now I will be dealing this particular session, and after this lecture 13 and 14 will be focused mostly on industrial policies. So it will also incorporate new developments that we have seen. So with the revival of private sector in India's economy, there are certain changes that we have observed, and we had to also coordinate or orient our policies for the likely for the acceptance of the private sector. We have also learned from our neighbors, especially from China, how China has given importance to the small scale industries and how different industrial clusters helped China to come out as one of the strongest economies in the world. So we have also gone for a similar kind of development in India, and we have made a quite tremendous progress. And so far it has been really good in terms of achieving good growth and development. So this particular lecture will be mostly focusing on manufacturing, different indicators of manufacturing. We will be tracing the developmental process from 1950s, then mostly focused on post 2000 developments. We will be also looking at certain developments in the area of labor, because it is considered that when we started our industrialization process, we had a very rigid labor system, and because of that we did not sustain our high growth for a long time, because this started acting as one of the major impediments for the market's growth and development. And later, when we realized that this is going to be a big obstacle for the development of the economy, then we had to rationalize our labor laws. And in recent periods, especially in the last year 2020, we had to take certain drastic measures to make sure that our policies are in line with the market oriented economy that we are looking forward in our India's economy. So new liberal policies that we have adopted, in under that it is obvious that the labor laws will be more flexible, and it will be more towards the employer compared to employees. So those aspects we will be also dealing with. And towards the end, we will be focusing on special economic zones and export promotion zones, that how these two developments have led to the drastic change in the manufacturing landscape of the country across India. Not only manufacturing but services also, there is a special role of special economic zones, and each and everywhere we are experiencing some changes. So we will be discussing that also. So to start, I will be giving you the reference books and reading materials that one should refer. So I found this Banga and Das report on 20 years of India's liberalization experiences and lessons. I found this document really useful, so I would request everyone to please go through it. Then I have already mentioned the Ashima Goyal edited book on Handbook of the Indian Economy in the 21st Century, Understanding the Inherent Dynamics. It is published by Oxford University Press. Then I found Shaurya R article really quite intuitive, and it is an empirical work on India's economy, and it is really good. So especially on labor regulations. So it appeared in Journal Development Economics. The title is Labor Regulations and Contract Labor Use, Evidence from Indian Forms. Then I found Besley and Burgess paper, Can Labor Regulation Hinder Economic Performance, Evidence from India. It also appeared in QJE. And then we had Jan H, Manufacturing Growth and Employment Pattern in India since 1990s, the Indian Journal of Industrial Relations. And then I found Veermani and Hashim paper really good on the productivity of India's industrial growth. and this talk about J curve of productivity and growth, Indian manufacturing post liberalization phase. So, how certain developments were not conducive for immediate big push to the industrial growth, but we started realizing those high growth phases after 1990s. So, in 2000 we had some kind of movement which Virmani and Hashimi approved as a J curve. So, the key learning objectives should be that we will be focusing on understanding the landscape of industrial development in India in the context of recent developments post 2000 mostly, and then we will be also seeing looking at some indicators. We will be analyzing the industrial sector very at a very micro level, and we will be also focusing on certain aspects that we have not covered so far. So, to have an overview of recent developments and how recent measures have helped revive the economy, especially the industrial sector growth. So, without giving you some introduction about the past, it will not be good to go directly to the recent developments. So, I will just go through what we have already discussed in detail when we were discussing planning. So, maybe lecture 1 and 2 may be connected with this, and some of you may find that those 2 lectures quite useful. So, in this particular slide I am going to focus on certain industrial policies that we took and how we have gone from the highly regulated to a market economy. So, the first we discussed was the Industrial Policy Resolution 1956. It classified the sectors into the Schedule A, Schedule B and Schedule C, and under that what we were supposed to do is that we kept 17 as an core, and then that was meant for the central government, which means that the central government was supposed to take lead in those. It included everything, infrastructure, core sectors, plus we also had atomic and all environmental sensitive sectors, plus we left 12 for the states to take, which means that the state level developments, if states were interested and if some states have advantage in the endowment of resources, then they can also take care, and then the rest were given to private sector. So, in Industrial Policy Revolution 1956, which was envisaged by the Mahalanobis, PC Mahalanobis, and that is why it is called Mahalanobis model. It came in during second 5-year plan. So, this particular Industrial Policy Revolution 1956 helped a lot in terms of setting the landscape of the industrial revolution in India, and it revolutionized. But one thing that gave rise during this particular period was that the government sector was completely dominant in the sphere of not only resource utilization, but exploration also. Then we had industrial policy in 1970, when we had a Dutt committee, and that committee had recommended for the MRTP Act, and MRTP Act allowed the role of the government sector, and but this policy resolution is also blamed for giving more importance to the large firms. So, certain industry under core sectors were kept for only large firms. So, the cap was of about 5 crore rupees, and then for heavy it was 1 to 5. Then middle somewhere with the help of both public and private, if there is a willingness, and if it is falling under the D license, then it was allowed, and for D license it was just 1 crore. So, these regulations also helped a lot in terms of giving more weightage to the large firms, and MRTP Act is known for this. Then we had Industrial Policy Revolution 1973, which gave importance to the SMEs. So, for the first time we had realized this, that we have to go for small and medium enterprises, and it was also decided that we should be having a segmental role of the industrial policies in terms of not just benefiting the large firm, but also the smaller firms. Then we had a Janata Party government in 1977 for the first time, non-Congress government, and this government took measures in terms of not only reviving the so the focus during this period, this industrial policy was not to just give the focus to the large industries, but the focus was so for the first time we had the classification of tiny unit. So tiny unit, a very small unit up to 1 lakh rupees if you have. So the asset size of 1 lakh rupees is sufficient to be incorporated under tiny unit, and there was a lot of developmental or institutional framework were prepared for the support of such tiny units, and even at the district level certain regulatory measures were taken, so that in case of any kind of regulatory hurdles, these small or tiny firms or tiny units will be we will be able to handle it. So the focus was that the cottage and handloom industries should be given more priorities, and whatever we have indigenous structure of having our own industrial setup supporting at a different level, not just in terms of at the very large scale, but at very small scale we have our indigenous industrial culture wherein we promote the certain goods and services at the very local level and in a periphery of 20 to 30 kilometers. So this industrial policy 1977 is having a lot of role in terms of redefining the industrial structure. So far we were focusing only on the capacities, but for the first time we realized our own potential, and we started focusing on the development of the industrial structure, the sub industrial structure that we had, and not just in terms of not just considering the agriculture or the related activities for the raw materials, but for the first time we realized that these peasants will also be part of such cottage and handloom industries. Then industrial policy 1980 gave a lot of importance to the modernization of industrial sector, and this particular sector at that point of time it was considered as, this particular policy, industrial policy 1980, is considered as one of the revamping processes of revitalizing the growth of public sector enterprises. So there was a whole lot of effort made to improve the organizational structure, functioning of the central public enterprises, and how these enterprises will be made accountable for their losses and how they will be made efficient. So industrial policy 1980 is considered as one of the major contributors, and from here onwards we focus on domestic competition. We had also gone for technological upgradation. There were certain incentives taken. So here in this particular time we started giving importance to the role of technological collaborations. A lot of companies were encouraged to have investment collaborations. So 1980s was the period when we started realizing the phase of real modernization of India that we had. But because of our political development, the progress was very slow. But after 1991 debacle, we were forced to do under IMF structural adjustment program, and because of that we had taken certain drastic measures. So industrial policy 1991, as we all are aware of, that this was the gateway for opening up the economy, and then we took measures at each and every level, and we also analyzed the sectors not only in terms of thinking about just the liberalization process happening only in industrial. We opened for each and every sector, even agriculture got benefited, but we realized the benefit only after 5 to 6 years. There is a laggard for such measures. We also took measures to revive the services sector. Certain rules and regulations were reoriented to make sure that services sector does not face any hurdle in terms of exporting or importing of goods and technologies that whatever they require. So this industrial policy was quite creative and gigantic in terms of not just progressing the India's growth, but also it helped in terms of reviving the policies for the modernization modern India that we have. So if you compare in terms of organized and unorganized sector, so organized sector, what happens that in organized sector you have a whole lot of organizations. Since beginning we have gone for the public sector development. So under organized sectors, the labor will have the regular job, and then they will have regular salaries or some kind of regulation process is considered under organized. So that's why it's called organized sector. Unorganized sector will have formal, informal work and may not be having the regular work, and they may be hired and fired anytime. So this is called unorganized sector. So, if you look at the manufacturing sector growth, you will find that 1950s we had set the path for the higher growth. So, we had the manufacturing sector growth of 5.6%. In 1960s, it came down to 5.4% because at that time we had our own domestic troubles, plus we had to go for certain droughts, and then we had to also face political uncertainty. In 1970s, it was more severe because we had at that time our own economy not doing good because of the 1973 oil price shocks, plus we had our political conditions not very favorable. So, because of that we had to feel the bottlenecks at every level in terms of availability of food grains, availability of raw materials, availability of infrastructure investment. Some orientation was missing at this point of time. 1980 onwards, we can see that we are able to achieve or maintain the growth rate of more than 5%. So, the 1970s era is only era where we see that there is a decline in the manufacturing sector growth, but after that we see there is a whole lot of effort to make sure that, and post 2000 we have better growth. So, 7.4% we had between 2000 to 2007. I have taken it from Banga and Das, and he has very nice table on this to make sure that we have a clear cut understanding. Since we had progress more on the organized sector front, and we had organized our economy in more like a formal setup. So, that is why we have a more growth recorded in organized sector compared to the unorganized, though you will find that in 1970s organized and unorganized both have the similar number 4.1 and 4.3, and this could be because of the similar situation faced by the organized and unorganized. And during 1970s also we had to go for certain changes, and that were required at that point of time. Unorganized got a shock in, and after that we can see that unorganized got a more shock during 1980s when we had liberalized our process and we had restricted. But at that time, because of these changes, we see a lot of growth in organized sector, and that could be because of the readjustment that we had. And after that it had continued, and we also see the rise in unorganized post 2000, because post 2000 gave rise to the private sector in a much more manner, in a more comprehensive manner, and that is why it has continued even after 2000. 7.8 is in organized and 6.6 is in unorganized. If you want to examine the manufacturing sector, then we can examine from this perspective. One is productivity, then we have employment, then we have optimal utilization of resources. These are the very common factors that we always have in mind when we think about manufacturing growth or industrial growth. Right. Now, I will be focusing now on the labor. So, we have now considered the organized and unorganized. Let us spend some time, at least 5 or 6 minutes, on understanding the India's industrial development. So, in India's industrial development from the perspective of labor. So, it has been mentioned that in the beginning when we started our industrialization process, we were more having a very rigid kind of labor market, and because of that it was very difficult for not only the private entrepreneurs, but also for the public sector to function, and the strikes and labor unionism were the norms of the market at that point of time. So, in somewhere some economists have reported that the labor laws at that time was one of the major impediments for the high industrial growth in India. So, Industrial Dispute Act 1947 is considered as one of the major document. So, at that point of time we had decided about that if there is any dispute between labor and employer, then there will be certain rules to decide, and how we will be deciding about those rules. So, those rules will be mostly based on how we can how this particular labor, whether the labor will have more power than the employer and employer will have more right than the labor. So, those dimensions were added under the Industrial Disputes Act 1947, and this act still is considered one of the important documents to refer. And most of the labor laws in India hovers around this particular act, and it is more like a balance, because at that time we had gone for a more like a welfare state. So, we find a lot of rules and regulations more in favor of welfare of the labor, and in somewhere you will find that the employer feel tighten about their rules and regulations. So Industrial Disputes Act is the first act that deals with the relation between employer and employees. Besley and Burgess 2004, which I referred, they have mentioned that while some Asian economies saw increase in manufacturing share from 8% to up to 28%, and it was reported in case of Malaysia, Indonesia, and then Indonesia, and then we had Thailand during 1960s to 1995, and during this period we were able to increase the manufacturing share only from 13 to 18% of GDP. Now, which means that in this particular period there is a whole lot of scope to analyze this particular development in the context of data and whatever we have the information available. So, Besley and Burgess 2004 find that labor market regulations were also responsible for the one of the major contributors to such a moderate growth of manufacturing sector. So, if you look from the perspective, so it was found that what he reports in the paper, which appeared in Quarterly Journal of Economics, this is one of the best journals in the area of economics and published by Harvard University. Now, this particular Besley and Burgess, they say that the states which had pro-worker labor laws, there they found that this particular law distorted the output, investment, employment, and even welfare in the urban areas, because though it was meant that the labor will have the welfare, but ultimately it has backfired in many cases. So, state wise, if you see the regulatory changes in India, you will find that Andhra Pradesh in 1968 and 1982, they were more of having the policy of pro-employer. In case of Karnataka also it was pro-employer. Kerala also it had in 1979 it had gone for pro-employer. Andhra Pradesh later in 1987 they had redrafted the labor laws, and then they had gone from pro-employer to pro-worker. Rajasthan in 1960 it had also implemented pro-employer policy. Tamil Nadu it had in 1982 it had also implemented the pro-employer policies, labor law. In case of Bengal in 1974-1980 it was pro-worker again. Rajasthan, Odisha, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, all these states had the pro-worker policies, and that is why it was found that these states were lagging behind compared to the states which were pro-employer. But if you compare the 60s era, then you may not find that much difference, because at that time most of these states were also reeling under the backwardness pressure that they had to. But post 1990s there has been a lot of improvement, and post 2000 we can see the stark difference. But as per this study it was found, it appeared in 2014, they reported that the states which had the law with regard to the pro-worker, they had distortions in output, employment generation and everything. I also referred this aspect from one more study by Chore and R. It was labor regulations and contract labor force, and it was found that the contract wise labor, which means the contract worker share, has increased over the years, even in all the states which are either pro-worker, pro-employer or neutral. So, we can see that the contract share in all the states is increasing, which means that there is a less regulation of work, and there is a likelihood that in a particular state more number of people will be opted for the contractual job compared to a regular job. So, this particular finding also gives a lot of idea about how we have progressed on the pattern, how it was required to support the policy that we were pursuing at that point of time. So, from 1999 we can see that it is increasing till 2007, right. And then we now will be focusing on the productivity growth 1980s versus 1990s. So, there is a very good IMF staff paper by Veermani and Hashim 2011, and what they report that when we had during 1980s era, the productivity was 0.61%. in the manufacturing sector. It decreased during 1990s to 0.25, but again it picked up during 2000 at increased by 1.41%. So, the phenomena that we study in case of international trade and economics is that when a country devaluates its domestic currency, then in the beginning, because of the not having that much impact on the price of import, and that's why the country does not feel immediately the increase in export, and that is why in the beginning it forms it declines, then becomes stagnant, and then it start increasing. So, the trade deficit will not be eradicated immediately by the devaluation of domestic currency, but it takes time. So, there is some lag period, and that is what we in international economics we call that J curve effect. In the similar way, they also reported the similar thing with the case of productivity. So, they say that they say that it is the total factor productivity. So, India had to take measures during 1990s, and at that time we were going for liberalization process, and this liberalization process had also created a scarcity of certain skills, and also in terms of raw material, certain establishments, and our manpower was also not very supportive of that, and that is why there was a laggard. But the measures that were undertaken during 1990s started giving it started becoming fruitful in 2000s, and that is why we have the productivity increase, a tremendous increase in productivity by 1.41%. So, this J curve productivity growth is often asked in your exams, and even when you appear for any kind of competitive examinations, you may be asked to define this what is the J curve productivity growth that we experience, and this became one of the hotter debated topic, that whether it was smooth or there was any laggard period. Few studies have also reported a structure break in 1981, because at that time we had gone for delicensing measures. We had delicensed a large number of industries that were under licensing categories, and that also gave rise to the so industrial policy of 1980s is considered as one of the major contributors, because we had defined we had gone for a separate classification of core sectors, and the certain activities were part of that. So, if you want to go through this, so you can go through from the IMF working paper, Weermani and Hashim DA. This is J curve of productivity and growth, India's manufacturing post liberalization, IMF working paper. Then we also discuss about the productivity growth, which continued from 1990s to 2000, and we compare that during this particular period we are just thinking about how we can compare in terms of productivity growth of 1990s and 2000. So, this continued. So, maybe we will discuss this in the next session, but so far what we have discussed is quite interesting, that we evaluated the industrial process in the country, and then we also looked at how labor laws were quite detrimental in terms of not only decreasing the welfare or reducing the welfare of the workers, but it has also impacted the state's growth. So, the diversity that we see in terms of growth patterns across the states, one of the reasons is this. So, at that time if policymaker would have gone for some kind of reunification or some kind of reorientation of those labor laws, then that would have helped. But since we were in the process of adopting on going for aggressive industrialization. So, at that time unionism was the common norm that we had to experience, and also that we had gone for adoption of certain macroeconomic policies that were supporting the rigid labor laws. So, in the next session we will start from here, and we will be focusing on the productivity growth during 1990s and 2000. Thank you so much.